Imagine carrying blood you never asked for. The same blood that belonged to Adolf Hitler. Not in the abstract sense of history, not as a name in a textbook, not as a figure studied through grainy footage. Nephew. To wake up each morning knowing that the blood running through your veins is the same blood that plunged the world into fire and ruin. For most of us, history is something outside ourselves, something that happened to others long ago. But for Hitler's family, history was a shadow they could never escape. They didn't inherit his power. They didn't inherit his wealth. They inherited something far heavier. They inherited his shame. The year is 1945. Berlin lies in ruins. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years of glory has collapsed in smoke and rubble. Adolf Hitler is dead. His body burned in a bunker. His empire shattered. His name destined to live forever in infamy. But his family? They are still alive. And for them, the war is not over. Because survival did not bring freedom. It brought suspicion. It brought silence. It brought the unbearable weight of being bound by blood to the most hated man who ever lived. Imagine what it would feel like to walk into a cafe, a market, a church, knowing that if anyone discovered your name, they might spit at you, turn away, or call the police. Imagine being questioned not for what you have done, but for who your brother was. Imagine lying awake at night, wondering if it would have been easier, cleaner, if you had died in that bunker too. This is their story. The story of Paula, the forgotten sister, of Alois Jr., the restless brother, of William Patrick, the nephew who fought against his uncle in uniform, yet could never shed the family curse. It is the story of shame, of exile, of a family that chose silence and extinction over survival. To be related to Hitler was not simply to share his blood, it was to carry a curse that no amount of denial, distance, or disguise could erase. Stay with me, because over the next 2 hours, we will step inside the hidden lives of those who bore his name. We will feel what they felt, the fear, the humiliation, the impossible choices. And perhaps, in the quiet spaces between history's facts, we will ask ourselves, if it were me, what would I have done?
Göring was captured. Himmler was gone. But the family of Adolf Hitler remained, and to the victors, blood alone was reason enough for suspicion. Paula Hitler, his only full sister, was dragged before American intelligence officers in Vienna. She was not asked about her childhood or her dreams. She was asked about him. About Adolf. About the brother she had once laughed with as a child, and who now defined her entirely in the eyes of strangers. To the Americans, she was not Paula. She was the sister. Elsewhere, his half-brother Alois Jr. lived under the same shadow. His daughter Angela was interrogated. Nephews and nieces were tracked. Some fled, some denied, some went silent. But none escaped the weight of the question, are you related to him? Imagine what that felt like. To carry a name that turned every eye toward you. To walk into a room and know that before you spoke a word, people already judged you guilty. You did not fight in the war. You did not build the camps. You did not command armies. Yet the world looked at you as though his crimes ran in your veins. For the world, the name Hitler meant evil incarnate. For his family, it became a prison with invisible bars. Neighbors whispered. Employers hesitated. Governments kept files on them. They lived in constant fear of recognition. Some tried to reinvent themselves with new surnames, aliases stitched onto official documents like desperate disguises. Others withdrew, speaking less and less, until silence became their only defense. The war had ended. But for them, history had just begun, a history they never chose, yet could never escape. Her name was Paula. But to the world, she would never be Paula again. She was Hitler's sister. Born in 1896, Paula was the youngest child of Alois and Clara Hitler, Adolf's only full sibling. As children, she adored her brother. He teased her, protected her, sometimes scolded her, but in her eyes, he was her closest ally in a house ruled by their father's heavy hand. When Clara died in 1907, it was Paula and Adolf who remained closest. They shared the ache of loss, the silence of grief, and the bond of siblings trying to survive their father's sternness. But history has a cruel way of turning bonds into burdens. By 1945, Paula's life was no longer her own. When the Allies came, she was living in Vienna under the name Paula Wolf. The choice of Wolf was no accident. Wolf had been Adolf's own chosen nickname, used among intimates, a name he once embraced as a sign of power. For Paula, adopting it was not to honor him, but to survive by concealing her own surname. To live as Hitler was to invite suspicion, harassment, even violence. To be Paula Wolf was, at least on paper, to be no one at all. Yet no disguise could hide her forever. In May 1945, American intelligence officers tracked her down. She was interrogated in Vienna, questioned about her brother's rise, his madness, his crimes. The transcripts reveal her denials, her evasions, her insistence that she had known little of politics. But the humiliation was not in the questions themselves. It was in the gaze of the men who asked them. For them, she was not Paula, not Wolf. She was the sister. The living proof that blood binds, even when love and loyalty have faded. Imagine sitting there, surrounded by soldiers of a conquering army, your every word transcribed, your every gesture judged, not for what you had done, but for who you were related to. Imagine realizing that no answer you gave would ever free you from suspicion. That your very existence was the evidence against illusion. She slipped back into obscurity, living a life of poverty in Vienna. She never married. She never had children. She survived on a small pension, living in rented rooms, often alone. To her neighbors, she was a quiet woman, withdrawn, carrying secrets no one wanted to hear. There were moments when she spoke of her brother, sometimes with hesitation, sometimes with surprising tenderness. In a recorded interview late in life, she admitted she had loved him as a brother but could not understand what he had become. It was as if she lived two parallel lives, one where Adolf was the sibling she adored, another where he was the monster the world condemned. Reconciling the two was impossible. And so she lived in silence. Silence became her survival. Silence was her shield against shame. Silence was the only way she could endure the name she carried in her blood. Paula Hitler died in 1960, alone, in a modest home in Berchtesgaden. No grand funeral, no family legacy. Just a quiet end to a quiet life, remembered only because of the brother whose shadow she could never escape. Think of her, not as an abstraction, but as a woman. A woman who once held her brother's hand as a child, who later sat across from interrogators who saw her as nothing but his echo. Think of her in the silence of her rented room, carrying a burden she never chose. Paula Hitler's life is a reminder that history does not just claim the powerful. It clings to those nearest them, binding their identities forever to deeds they did not commit. And for Paula, the curse of being the sister was not simply that others would never forget her name. It was that she herself could never escape it. If Paula's burden was silence, Alois Jr.'s was scandal. Alois Hitler Jr. was Adolf's half-brother, the son of their father's earlier marriage. Born in 1882, Alois Jr. grew up in the same stern household, but unlike Paula, he rebelled against it. Where Adolf would later channel his frustrations into obsession and ideology, Alois Jr. lashed out against authority in more ordinary ways. He drifted, drank, and argued. He became restless, unreliable, a man who could never quite find his place. In time, he left Austria altogether. His path took him to Dublin, where he opened a restaurant. It was there, in Ireland, that he met Bridget Dowling, a young Irish woman who would one day find herself trapped in one of history's strangest marriages. At first, it was a simple love story, an Austrian man running a business abroad, a local woman charmed by his foreign accent and confidence. They married in 1910. But soon, the shadow of his name crept in. For Bridget, becoming Mrs. Hitler was not just a change of surname. It was the beginning of a life of whispers, suspicion, and endless explanations. Imagine walking down the streets of Dublin or London during the rise of the Nazis, introducing yourself as Mrs. Hitler. Imagine the glares, the questions, the mockery, the fear. Your very name, the one thing you cannot escape, becomes a weapon others use against you. The marriage was far from happy. Alois Jr. was volatile, often absent, sometimes cruel. In time, Bridget found herself alone with their son, William Patrick, carrying not just the stigma of the Hitler name but also the burden of holding her family together. Neighbors gossiped. Friends distanced themselves. Employers hesitated to deal with them. The surname was not merely a label. It was a brand, etched onto them by the actions of a man across the sea who would one day drag the world into chaos. For Bridget, the shame was not theoretical. It was lived in every conversation, every introduction, every sideways glance. She had not chosen this name, yet it followed her like a curse. Alois Jr., restless as ever, left Bridget and their son behind for long stretches, seeking work and stability he never truly found. He wandered between England, Austria, and Germany, sometimes trying to capitalize on his connection to Adolf, sometimes fleeing from it. His life was unsettled, his marriage fractured, his identity consumed by a brother who overshadowed him in every possible way. And yet, the cruelest weight fell not on Alois or Bridget, but on their son, William Patrick, a boy born into a family name that would define his entire existence. Of all Adolf Hitler's relatives, none carried the burden more visibly than his nephew, William Patrick Hitler. Born in 1911 to Alois Jr. and Bridget Dowling, William entered the world already bound to contradiction. On one side, an Irish mother who longed for normalcy. On the other, a German father tied to a family name that would one day horrify the world. For William, childhood was a tug-of-war between cultures, Ireland, England, Germany. He was teased, questioned, whispered about. And as his uncle Adolf rose to power in the 1930s, William's surname became not just unusual, but infamous. Still, curiosity pulled him toward Germany. In the early 1930s, William visited his uncle, already rising within the Nazi Party. He was granted audiences with Adolf himself, moments almost impossible to imagine. Picture it, a young man in his 20s, sitting across from his uncle, who was not yet the dictator of Europe, but already the commanding figure who would soon become one. What did William feel, staring into those pale, calculating eyes? Did he see only an uncle, a family face, or did he sense the abyss already forming in him? The transcripts and testimonies hint at unease. William was treated politely but distantly. He was never embraced as family, never welcomed as kin. And yet, Adolf's shadow gave William a strange, double-edged weapon, opportunity and shame. In Germany, he could claim special access, even favor. But outside, he was marked, tainted, distrusted. Wherever he went, the question followed, are you really his nephew? In time, William turned against his uncle. He wrote articles for American magazines, exposing Adolf's arrogance and cruelty. He gave interviews, standing as a living link to the dictator but daring to condemn him publicly. It was a dangerous choice, one that branded him both a traitor to his uncle and a curiosity to the press. But William went further. When the Second World War broke out, he joined the U.S. Navy. Imagine the scene, a man carrying the Hitler bloodline, wearing the uniform of America, taking up arms against his own uncle. It was not just rebellion. It was defiance written in action, in blood, in loyalty to a country that adopted him. Still, the paradox followed him everywhere. Fellow sailors whispered. Some mocked. Others distrusted. His surname was never forgotten, never ignored. He could serve bravely, but he could not shed the weight of the family curse. After the war, William married, settled in America, and had children. But the legacy of his name was too much to pass on. His sons later made a vow. A chilling, deliberate vow, never to have children. In their silence, the Hitler bloodline would die. For William, life was a series of masks. To some, he was the traitorous nephew who turned against the Führer. To others, he was a man forever stained by his surname. But beneath it all, he was simply a man trying to carve an identity separate from history's darkest shadow. Imagine being him, knowing that your name opened doors and closed them, earned applause and suspicion, brought opportunity and exile. Imagine living every day as both a survivor and a symbol, a man who hated his uncle but could never escape him. William Patrick Hitler died in 1987, in Long Island, New York, under the name William Stewart Houston. He had tried, one final time, to bury the name. To erase the stain. To give his children a life free from whispers. But history remembers. And even today, his story remains the strangest paradox of all. The nephew who fought against his uncle, and yet could never stop being Hitler's nephew. Not every relative of Adolf Hitler defied him in public. Not every relative wrote articles, gave interviews, or enlisted to fight against his regime. Some chose another path, a path of silence, of disappearance, of fading into the shadows. Among them was Angela Raubel, Adolf's half-sister. Born in 1883, Angela lived much of her adult life quietly, raising children, working as a housekeeper. When Adolf rose to power, she accepted a position at his mountain retreat, the Berghof. She cooked for him, managed staff, and kept house. But being close to him was never without cost. Her daughter, Jelly Robbel, moved into Adolf's Munich apartment. And in 1931, Jelly died suddenly from a gunshot wound. Officially ruled suicide, whispers of scandal and control swirled around Adolf for decades afterward. For Angela, silence was her only survival. She buried her grief, avoided questions, and never dared speak publicly against the brother who had become both head of state and shadow over her family. Alois Jr., restless and embittered, also drifted into obscurity in his later years. He had left Bridget, quarreled with William, and lived much of his life unsettled, unmoored. By the war's end, his name carried too much danger. His solution was not to fight, not to resist, but to vanish. He lived in anonymity, fading from history's gaze, as though hoping the world would forget he had ever existed. Other cousins and distant kin scattered across Europe. Some changed their surnames. Some moved to small towns. Some simply refused to speak of their ancestry, even to their closest friends. Imagine living with such a secret. Imagine knowing that one careless word, one slip in conversation, could destroy your safety, your reputation, your livelihood. These were not people seeking fame or power. They were people who longed for invisibility. They wanted to be forgotten, not remembered. They wanted to vanish into the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. But the name Hitler was not ordinary. It was a shadow that followed them, even when unspoken. Think of what it meant to go to sleep each night carrying a surname you dared not say out loud. Think of what it meant to watch the world debate your brother, your cousin, your relative, while you sat silently at a kitchen table, pretending you were no one at all. For these silent relatives, survival meant erasure. Erasure of their names. Erasure of their identities. Erasure of the truth that they were bound by blood to the most infamous man in history. It is easy to remember the names we hate. Adolf Hitler will never be forgotten. But his family, the ones who chose silence, remind us of another truth: sometimes survival depends not on being remembered, but on being erased. The war was over. The camps were opened. The truth was revealed. The world had seen the horror Adolf Hitler unleashed, and no one could remain untouched by it. But while nations rebuilt, his relatives were left under a different kind of rubble, the gaze of the world. For Paula, for Alois Jr., for William Patrick, and for the cousins who tried to vanish, life was never private again. The moment someone learned their name, the questions began. Are you related to him? Do you believe in what he did? What do you know? The question was always the same, whether whispered by neighbors, shouted by journalists, or asked in cold interrogation rooms. The press, hungry for stories, treated them as curiosities. Headlines introduced Paula not as a woman in her 60s, but as Hitler's sister. William Patrick was labeled the Führer's nephew. Even when they wanted to live as ordinary people, newspapers dragged them back into infamy. Their identities were reduced to footnotes of a nightmare. Governments, too, never stopped watching. Allied intelligence files reveal how relatives were tracked, questioned, sometimes followed. Guilt was assumed to run in the veins, and the stain of blood was harder to erase than any uniform or party badge. To be a Hitler was to be guilty until proven otherwise, and sometimes, even then. But perhaps the cruelest judgment came not from governments or the press, but from ordinary strangers. Imagine walking into a store and handing over an identity card with the word Hitler printed across it. Imagine the silence that follows, the clerk's eyes narrowing, the way voices drop as others overhear. Imagine parents pulling their children closer. A simple act, buying bread, signing a form, cashing a check, could turn into humiliation. The weight of the world's gaze was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. A neighbor's stare. A child's cruel joke. A whisper behind a hand. And sometimes that silence was worse than words. These relatives lived in a paradox. They had no part in Adolf's crimes. Many despised him. Some even fought against him. And yet, to the world, they were guilty by blood. History remembers the powerful for what they did. But sometimes, it remembers the powerless for what they chose not to do. By the mid-20th century, Hitler's surviving relatives had scattered. They were not leaders, not rulers, not criminals on trial. They were fragments of a family shattered by war. And yet they carried one thing that none of them could ever put down, the name. Paula Hitler lived out her days in obscurity. She had no husband, no children, no descendants. She survived on a small pension, avoided publicity, and died in 1960 in Berchtesgaden, the very town where her brother once dreamed of empire. Her silence was her legacy. In the end, Paula left no heirs. William Patrick Hitler, perhaps the most famous of them all, retreated into the quiet rhythm of suburban America. After the war, he changed his name to William Stewart Houston. He settled on Long Island with his wife, raised sons, and tried to pass for an ordinary American. But the surname he abandoned remained a ghost in his life. Neighbors whispered, reporters occasionally sought him out, and no matter how many years passed, he could not truly erase the truth. And yet, it was William's sons who made the most haunting choice of all. They grew up in America, far from Germany, far from the rubble of Europe. They were educated, intelligent, ordinary young men in every sense but one. They carried the bloodline of Adolf Hitler. At some point, quietly, privately, they made a pact. Never to have children. Never to pass on the name. Never to let the bloodline continue. Think of what that means. Most families dream of carrying their name into the future, of watching children grow, of passing down stories and traditions. But for these men, continuation was not a blessing, it was a threat. To bring children into the world would mean giving life to a curse. And so, they chose silence not only for themselves, but for generations unborn. Their decision was not written in headlines. It was not announced to the world. It was lived, year by year, as marriages ended without children, as lives passed without heirs. It was an extinction carried out in silence. And so the Hitler bloodline, one of the most infamous in history, is ending, not through war or violence, but through deliberate choice. A choice made not by the dictator, but by those who bore his name against their will. This is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. That Adolf Hitler dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich, of endless generations shaped by his will. Yet his own family, his own blood, chose to erase themselves. His empire collapsed in 12 years. His family line, by their own vow, collapses with them. Silence. Extinction. A bloodline deliberately brought to an end. To be related to Adolf Hitler was never to inherit power. It was never to inherit wealth. It was only to inherit shame.
His relatives lived not as heirs of an empire, but as prisoners of a name. Some tried to erase themselves. Some tried to fight against him. Some chose silence. And in the end, some chose extinction itself. Think of Paula, who lived and died in obscurity, remembered only because of the brother she could never escape. Think of Alois Jr., restless and unsettled, who spent his life drifting between denial and shame. Think of William Patrick, who crossed the ocean, fought against his uncle, yet could never escape being the Führer's nephew. And think of his sons, who chose to let the family line end, to ensure that Adolf Hitler's name would die with them. Adolf dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich, of a future stretching endlessly beyond his own life. But history has a way of undoing tyrants. His empire collapsed in 12 years. His family chose silence. His bloodline will vanish into time. And yet, the curse of a name is not so easily erased. Because names, like history, never truly die. They linger in memory, in whispers, in shadows. And even when the blood is gone, the questions remain. So I ask you, if you carried the most hated name in history, what would you do? Would you hide it, reject it, or embrace it? Think carefully, because history is not only what we inherit, it is also what we choose to pass on.